The Lord be with you. Well, welcome back to this video series that we have been doing through the life of Jonah. We've been telling the narrative of Jonah's story and how that is quite possibly and probably intended to be a good paradigm for us and our discipleship. And believe it or not, this is our last video in the series. We have read through all 4 chapters of Jonah, except for the last few verses in the final chapter, and we are poised and ready to do that part today. So just by way of reminder, Jonah's story is kind of broken into halves. The first half is very much about Jonah's churning away from God. So even though he's a prophet of God, even though he's someone who serves God, who has been called by God, who has the very words of God put in his mouth, that's what a prophet is, someone who proclaims the words that God gives them. Jonah chooses, strangely enough and shockingly enough, to not obey God and to willingly churn away from him. So through all sorts of calamities that befall him and a juxtaposition of what Jonah's response being an Israelite is compared to the response of the Gentiles who don't even worship Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, as their primary God. The Gentiles are the ones who end up listening, who end up worshiping, who end up offering sacrifice, even while Jonah keeps churning further and further away. The churning point seems to be in the belly of the great fish, this womb of prayer where Jonah has an opportunity to be alone with God and to churn his heart and his prayer back towards God, back towards Jerusalem, back towards the temple. And he has this Thanksgiving experience. And therefore, when the fish vomits him out on the dry land, this time, Jonah, given the same call, chooses to respond and to be obedient, at least in some simple fashion. And when he proclaims this message of impending judgment to the Ninevites, they churn away from all of their sin and evil and violence that they have been doing throughout society. And then God, in turn, churns away from the calamity that he has promised to bring upon them. And this is what re-triggers Jonah. Jonah becomes angry, and Jonah expresses to God that he is not pleased. And this is the very reason he didn't want to go in the first place, as he knew this very well might happen. And that's where we left the story off. This is where we are picking up right after Jonah expressing his displeasure to God. This is chapter 4, and the final verses for us to read today are verses 5 through 11. Jonah left the city and found a place east of the city where he made himself a shelter and sat down under it in its shade to see what would happen to the city. Yahweh God prepared a castor bean plant and made it grow up over Jonah to shade his head and relieve his discomfort. So Jonah was delighted with the castor bean plant. But at dawn the next day, God prepared a worm, which attacked the castor bean plant so that it dried up. Then when the sun rose, God prepared a scorching east wind, and the sun beat down on Jonah's head so hard that he grew faint. And he begged that he could die, saying, "I would be better off dead than alive." God asked Jonah, "Is it right for you to be so angry about the castor bean plant?" He answered, "Yes, it is right for me to be so angry that I could die." Yahweh said, "You are concerned over the castor bean plant, which cost you no effort. You did not make it grow. It came up in a night, and it perished in a night. So shouldn't I be concerned about the great city of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 people who do not know their right hand from their left, not to mention all the animals?" And that, my friends, is where the story ends. And these are the true words of our eternal God. But what an interesting, mysterious, and potentially frustrating ending. God asks a question that we never get an answer to. Now, to be sure, all throughout the narrative of Jonah, it is about understanding who God is. Jonah begins with a certain level of understanding about God, but God doesn't want us to just have an entry-level understanding of him. He wants us to have a relationship. Relationships require growth. Jonah tries to stay in this little bubble of thinking of God as someone who loves him and who loves his people, which is true, but Jonah wants to stay there. Jonah wants to see all the benefits of God's love and God's mercy, but he doesn't necessarily want those shared with people that he doesn't like, people who have been sworn enemies of his and his people, people who have done harm to him. Jonah wants to reserve God's grace for himself. So God tries to teach Jonah, to push Jonah towards growth. You know, it's interesting. God could have struck Jonah dead at so many different points in this narrative. I mean, he could have drowned in the sea. He could have died in the belly of the great fish. Most people, you get eaten alive by a fish in the middle of the ocean, and you're not coming back from that. But God keeps preserving him. God keeps allowing him to get to the next level, the next stage. And even in this situation, when Jonah is angry and upset with God, for some reason, he still makes a shelter and sits outside of the city of Nineveh to see what's going to happen. It's almost as if he expects that maybe judgment still might come. So God's object lesson for Jonah comes through nature. So many things have come through nature in this narrative. The storm on the waters, the great fish, and now we have this plant. Even though Jonah has built a shelter, notice that it's inadequate. The shelter isn't the thing that's bringing him the most amount of relief. So God is the one who brings him the most amount of relief through a natural means. He causes this plant to grow up, and in its big, leafy, miraculous shade, Jonah is comforted and spends the first day very, very pleased with the blessings that he's receiving from God. But overnight, God sends a worm, just like he sent the great fish before. The worm does damage. The worm kills the plant effectively so that in the morning it is all shriveled. And then God makes the day, just like he made the storm, as miserable as he can possibly make it, with the sun beating down with such intensity and the wind blowing from the east off of the desert with such intensity that Jonah actually begs to die. He becomes angry, and God asks him the same question he did at the beginning of chapter 4. Is it right for you to be angry? The first time he's asking him if it's right for him to be angry about God's mercy to the Ninevites. This time he's asking him about the plant. And Jonah insists, yes, I have every right to be angry about the plant. And God asks a more introspective question. Why? You didn't do anything for this plant, Jonah. It doesn't belong to you. You didn't help it to grow. You didn't plant it. You didn't water it. You didn't nurture it. It's not your plant. And yet you have such strong emotional ties to it. Something that you don't own, something that you put little to no effort in. Now, here's the interesting thing, Jonah. I've put a lot of effort into people. I have made them. The people have scattered all around the world. The people don't know their right hand from their left, which is just a cultural saying for they don't know good from evil. They don't know which way they should go unless somebody tells them. So I've sent you, Jonah, to tell them, and you're not happy with that. But think about all of the time, all of the love, all of the care I have put into these more than 120,000 souls in this city. And that doesn't even speak to all of the animals and wildlife that are represented there, which is a wonderful reminder that God doesn't just care about human beings. He cares about all life. And that is literally the last thing that's said to Jonah is, I also care about the animals. And then it ends with this sort of open-ended question, which makes me wonder if maybe the end of Jonah's story is meant to be the beginning of our story. What do we think Jonah should do? How do we think Jonah should respond? Where is our relationship with God? And what are we doing with what we know about God to grow and to serve others out in the world? What is the mission that Jonah left incomplete? And where should we pick up the mantle of that and carry that mission on? There are so many examples in the Bible of people who have misrepresented God, even his own people. It is in the days of Moses that we are first introduced to this concept that God is the God who is merciful and compassionate and forgiving of thousands to the 10th generation. And yet Moses is also the one who gets in trouble when the people complain for the umpteenth million time, and he is told to mercifully grant the people water by doing what he has always done, by raising his staff over the rock and calling forth water. But Moses, in a situation of anger, which we all would have been in, I'm sure, strikes the rock twice, and when God brings about judgment against Moses, he says to him, you misrepresented me to the people. It isn't necessarily that Moses shouldn't have been mad in that moment, but he represented God in the wrong way. When we get to the New Testament stories, there's a story of Jesus and his disciples trying to pass through a Samaritan village. And Jesus sends some disciples ahead to prepare a place. And the Samaritans say, no, you can't stay here. So when the disciples come back and report this, two of Jesus's closer disciples, James and John, brothers, they say, do you want us to call down fire, Jesus, onto this village? And we're told that Jesus rebukes them. They misunderstand God, and they are misrepresenting the mission of the Messiah. And even here in Jonah, even though Jonah understands that God is a merciful God, forgiving of thousands, even as was revealed through Moses, he intentionally focuses on God's judgment. And when God doesn't bring judgment, Jonah sulks and becomes angry. How about us? The big picture that we're missing is God is trying to work all things out for good. Not just things in our own life, not just things in the church, not just things in Israel. He's trying to work all things out in the world for good. We read in one of the writings of Paul that God desires all people to be saved and to come to a knowledge of the truth. That means that even the people who persecute us, even the people who have said they don't believe in God, or the people who believe in other gods, or the people who are purposely persecuting people who follow Jesus and the way and the God of the Hebrews, somehow through our love and through our witness, we are to represent God correctly. And in doing so, God is then working all things out. For those of us who love him, for those of us who answer his call, and yes, there is something for us to learn through the life story of Jonah, that we need time in prayer. Prayer is going to be that womb that transforms us. We can be honest with God about our emotions and our feelings, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that God desires more than just our good and more than just us to experience his love and compassion and mercy. He desires us to share that with a hurting and broken world in such a way that on that final day when Jesus returns and all nations and all people are judged, there can be more in his kingdom than not, because his servants have been faithful and merciful and compassionate. Well, whereas this is the end of our Bible study, it is not the end of our mission. So, friends, I pray that you continue to have opportunities to learn these lessons and to live into the truth that God reveals to us through Jonah and through his story. There will be more videos, more series, more things to study in the Bible ahead. And whatever those may be and wherever they may come, I just pray that in the meantime, in these days of compassion and mission, may the peace of God continue to be with you. Amen.